Morning. Hello, everybody. So here we are at Wednesday. Welcome back. Just a couple of announcements. Okay, with regard to the live streaming, we've been telling you we've been doing this, and we now know that there are just 255 views around the world, Germany is the most, has 30 views, people are watching, yay! You've told your friends back home, and Greece comes in second with 21, so. I mean, after the U.S. has 160. It's probably us, watching it too. But everybody, way across Japan and Poland and France and everywhere. So just tell your friends and tell them, and you can watch later too. Whatever's going on in this room, if you happen to miss, you can watch. Now today, we're still going to have lunch, as usual. And it'll be box lunches, so it's kind of picnic style today, since today's our excursion day. I mean, you don't have to take your picnic lunch with you, but it's still, that sort of arrangement. So just go on down as usual. And our excursions will start at 1:30. They all last from 1:30 to 4:30. So some of you have been moving around, and that is fine if you want to switch, but please do that officially. Just go ahead and tell them at the registration desk so we'll really know who's on what roster and things. We'll be able to keep track of you. And it may rain today. I think they said 50% chance, which never means it's 50% chance, It's like, maybe a 10% chance. So, but if it does rain, I'm telling you, be ready for a downpour, because we can get some real torrential rain here. So what, though? It'll just be a refreshing, relief from the heat. The heat generates this rain. It probably won't rain. So all three excursions meet down by the front door. There's the walking tour. You'll just be meeting your guide and taking off for La Vita, the Alamo, and San Fernando Cathedral. And then there will be 2 buses to go to the missions. And we'll have signs, and we'll get you there. And then there'll be 1 bus, which will be going to the San Antonio Museum of Art and the Pearl. So we'll just get you where you've got to be. And then tonight we have green. You got to be sure to pronounce it green. That's the way the people say it around here, Looks like Grüne, but it used to be Grüne. And it is, of course, an old German ghost town that is now kind of revitalized and it has the oldest dance hall in Texas. So we'll be going there, and you'll have dinner on your own, but we'll get you to the grist mill. So we'll all walk to the grist mill, and we'll kind of be spread around the grist mill. It's a lovely place. And then when you're finished eating, whenever you finish up, you just walk on back to Green Hall. So, it's small, easy to do. Don't loiter too long over your meal, because you're going to want to get dancing over at Green Hall. And then we'll be coming back at 11 on 2 buses. We're taking 2 buses to Green. We're going to fill that place up, Oh, they're ready for us. And, I think that's all the announcements that I have right now, so I'll just be seeing you. Pardon? At what time? Yes, Green, 6 o'clock, okay? 6 o'clock we'll meet, so do be punctual, because we want to go on out there. It's a 45-minute drive. Okay, and I will now turn the microphone over to Brian Joseph.
Thank you, Bridget. Well, it's really a fun experience for me to be able to introduce our speaker today, our plenary speaker. Henning Anderson is someone I've had the pleasure of knowing for nearly 2 decades, someone I've taken long, entertaining, and informative walks with through woods and fields in Denmark and Japan and elsewhere. But I know you're not interested in my peripatetic behavior, but I can tell you that they've been entertaining walks because he's a really cool guy. Has lots of interesting things to say and has a good sense of humor. And they've been informative, too, because he's so knowledgeable about linguistics and about language and has very deep insights to offer. And that's why he's here today as a plenary speaker. Henning studied Slavic linguistics at Harvard, receiving his PhD in 1966 with a dissertation on tenues and medii in the Slavic languages, a historical investigation. He was trained in the Jakobsonian tradition and, in fact, was a student of Roman Jakobson's. Did his dissertation under Jakobson's watchful eye. And also in the Jakobsonian tradition, he has moved from Slavistics proper into discussing topics that go beyond Slavistics and addressing key issues in historical linguistics. He's best known, perhaps, for his 1973 paper, Abductive and Deductive Change, published in Language, volume 49. But over the years, he's made important contributions to the study of the emergence of grammar and grammatical elements, what he calls grammation, to the study of phonological change in general, to substratum effects in Balto-Slavic and thus prehistoric Europe, and to areas of concern to all historical linguists, whether Slavistically oriented or not. He edited an important book on Sundhi phenomena in Europe, European languages, for instance. Today he'll continue his enlightening discourse on general issues in historical linguistics. And after his talk, there will be a panel organized session that offers some reflections in 4 papers on topics of interest. I hope you can stay for that. His talk, as you can see, is entitled Paradigms, Synchrony, Diachrony, and History, so please join me in welcoming Henning Andersson to the podium.
I don't know what to say. Anyway, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Bridget, for inviting me and entrusting me with this lectern for some time. I didn't know what to do when I was invited to give a plenary talk, so I thought it over and accepted and sent in a title, and I didn't know what I was going to talk about, so I made the title as wide as possible. And by, I think, almost return mail, I was requested to send in an abstract. So if you have read the abstract, I'm going to try to follow the topic of the abstract as closely as possible. Anyway, so here we are. I wanted to see if I can manipulate this one first. I wanted to say a few words about history and synchrony and diachrony, as you can see, and I want to say something about paradigms and something about signs, and specifically something about indexical signs, and then there'll be a conclusion. I've been toying with the difference between language history and historical linguistics for some time. It seems to me that there is an interesting relationship between that. Being a language historian myself, in fact, I mostly work with prehistory, but also a historical linguist, it seems to me that I'm doing different things. The language historian is dedicated to ferreting out all the details of some period of development of the history of a language, whereas the historical linguist focuses on the structural problem across languages. So they work sort of in different directions. And of course, the historical linguist cannot do his work unless he's informed by the advances in historical linguistics. But then on the other hand, there wouldn't be any historical linguistics without language histories. So there is a sort of relationship of presupposition. Historical linguistics presupposes language histories. Is this interesting? No. Well, this is something you can muse about on an afternoon while you wait for the happy hour. Anyway, but there is also a distinction between language history and then what's called diachrony, not to mention synchrony. History, of course, is what it is. It's a stream of things that happen all the time as far as language history is concerned. It is talk and talk and talk and talk, and then an alternation of internalized grammars that we don't know anything about, except that we can make inferences about the grammars of the speaking, talking people by applying our methods of analysis. And these are the diachronic methods. So in order to know something about the history of language, which is essentially unreachable, we can reconstruct a skeletal account of it with our diachronic methods. Of course, there cannot be any diachrony without synchrony, because the diachronic account presupposes synchronic descriptions of slices at various stages of development. And so, although history is there, and it is what it is, or as Charles Peirce would say, such as it is, whatever anyone might think about it, we have our diachronic accounts, and they're based on synchronic slices. So there is a relationship of presupposition also between diachrony and synchrony. I mention this because there has been recently, in recent technical literature, some discussion about the relationship between synchrony and diachrony. For example, in natural morphology, it has been stated by Wurzel that synchrony and diachrony are just, there is no distinction between them, because in actuality, they are just transitions between synchronic stages. Of course, there are transitions, but that is the history. The history is what it is. And essentially, in the diachronic account, we have to reconstruct some transitions between synchronic stages, and we hope that they correspond somehow to the history of the language. But the history, in all its detail, is not accessible to us. So when Wurzel says that there's no difference between synchrony and diachrony, it's because he does not distinguish between the history of the language and then the methods that we use. And I think that distinction is somehow important. Diachrony is a metalinguistic reconstruction, just as synchronic descriptions are metalinguistic. I have to do some lubrication here. In my training, we read synchronic grammars with historical commentary. And I think that's okay, because then you have a synchronic descriptions with historical commentary. And I think that's fair. Then you make a distinction between the history and the synchronic description. I'm not going to be able to give a talk, obviously. Kiparsky has written about this in a review of Juliet Blevins' evolutionary phonology, where he points out that we should really have amphi-chronic descriptions. I think that's taking it a little too far. I think we should distinguish between diachrony and history. But in the final analysis, when we have a diachronic account of the development of a language, and we have synchronic descriptions of it, they should jibe. if you make a synchronic description of a language and we know something about its history, somehow we can correlate the synchronic description with what we know about the history. And so in a sense, we have to be able to reconcile the accounts, as we say in accounting. So much about synchrony and diachrony, which I think are really have to be distinguished from history because they are merely our methods of approaching it. I want to say something about paradigms too. And in doing that, I want to draw attention to the attempts that have been made in the past to imagine what sort of paradigms people have inside their minds. Hermann Powell does this in 1891, Saussure in 96, published in 1916. Hjelmslev sometime in the 30s, and Jacobson in 65. And each of them have this idea that inside people's minds are multidimensional paradigmatic structures in which elements of the most diverse kinds are associated. And I think that's probably a reasonable guess, though we can't be sure. We have our paradigms. We have inflectional paradigms and derivational paradigms. Syntactic paradigms will come up, and I think my friend Lars Heltoft is going to talk about them here. And in making these paradigms, which are man-made, so to say, or human-made, we try to set up some ordering principles. Some people decide that there shouldn't be any. You know, there's a long tradition since the 19th century of denying any order in paradigms. And so instead of having a case paradigm where you have the cases in a specific order, you deny that they're cases and number them instead. This is a Central European thing. You know from German perhaps, where they talk about first case, second case, third case, and fourth case. Erster Fall, zweiter Fall, dritter Fall, and so on. They do that in Czech too. But the idea of ordering principles goes back a long way. Danish linguist Rasmus Rask tried to order case paradigms in the various languages he analyzed, and he wrote a lot of grammars, synchronic grammars, and his idea was that you should always maximize syncretisms, so that languages that had the same expression, cases that had the same expression should be neighboring cases in your list of cases. Anyway, we can come up with various principles for ordering the exponenda in paradigms and then hope that they're right. But then we also have, once we talk about paradigms, we have paradigms of pragmatic options, paradigms of sentence patterns, paradigms of constructions, and then paradigms of morphological variance. If for a certain exponendum we have several possible expressions, they form a paradigm, and we then select the appropriate allomorph for the given context. And there are paradigms of stylistic variance. You decide whether you want to use a colloquial or a neutral or a formal or an archaic expression for a given exponendum. And there are paradigms of social variance expressing age group, gender, socioeconomic group membership. And I don't really want to talk about paradigms in linguistic theory, but you know that there's this discussion whether paradigms are recreated, pre-created, and then inserted after the syntactic structures have been worked out, or whether the flexions are assembled online, let's say, as people speak. I won't touch on that. Now, in inflectional morphology, we have some new problems and we have some old problems. The new problems have to do with diversity of techniques, the way how we can understand the diversity of techniques that are used. Affixation is easy to understand. The modifications of vowels, consonants, or tones are perhaps harder to understand. And then more recently, it has turned out that there's also phonotactic modifications that express inflection. Milchuk, many years ago, back in the 1900s, proposed a solution to this, namely that all inflection is parts of speech acts, and so they are minimal acts. The assignment of an expression to a content is an act. And so, in a sense, we have to conceive of affixation and mutation and phonotactic modification as processual. And I think one can do that. But of course it doesn't help much, except these are hypotheses we can make about the ontology of the morphological techniques. The old problems that we have are going to be with us for a long time, probably. I've given you a list here. It's alphabetical: empty morphs, multiple exponents, suppletivism, syncretism, and zero exponents. And there are ways of approaching these issues that have been used in the literature. And even though we can describe them, I'm not sure we'll ever completely agree on all possible ways of looking at them. And then I want to switch to the more concrete issues that I have on my plate today. Saussure's arbitrariness doctrine has played a special role in the category of synchronic morphology. The last several decades have produced frameworks that generate whole word forms directly from lists of Gramcats since Matthew 72, Anderson 92, Stump in the 1900s, Corbett and Company. And in this development, it is asserted that there is only one association between content and expression, namely the arbitrary one. And I think that in doing this sort of mechanical production of expressions from complex symbols, we overlook essential parts of morphological system. And that is sort of a sad development. Let me draw your attention to the work by Aronoff in 1994 on the English perfect participles. Aronoff observed that the passive and perfect, quite diverse categories, share exponents or share expressions despite their distinct syntactic properties. And that led him to conclude that there is morphology that is not assigned to syntax, morphology that exists by itself. And that is fine when you have a view of grammar in which content and expression are totally arbitrarily assigned. But I don't think it works so well if you have a different view of grammar. This is what I would like to promote. In Aronoff's terminology, then the perfect forms, the passive and the perfect, are called morpheme because there are no morpheme relations between expression and content. And in doing this, he sort of described the marked categories of the English verb system without even looking at the unmarked ones. And I think he makes an error in this. There is a descriptive principle that the marked categories should be described on the basis of the unmarked. And this focus on participles make him miss the major structural feature of the English verb morphology, namely that each of the forms for present and past serves both finite and non-finite functions. Take a form like move. We move is a finite, and then we want to move. There you have the infinitive, and the imperative is move. So these quite diverse categories share one and the same expression. And in the past tense, moved is both finite, it's passive, we were moved, and it's active, perfect, we have moved. So this is the principle of English verb morphology, a sort of economy of exponents, as I call it here, which can be described simply as a syncretism in a paradigm of exponenda, a paradigm of verbal categories. And as such, it calls for a typological interpretation. Perhaps this is not unusual in languages that have a very poor morphology, such as English, but it doesn't call necessarily for a new label, the label of morpheme. Aronoff's idea of these cases of morphology by itself or for itself his ideas have been adopted by others. They've become very popular among Romance linguists, where, for example, Martin Radin has observed that there are many morphomes in Italian verbal morphology. Here you see one example. First plural and second plural have forms in verbal paradigms in Italian which are similar in the number of syllables and in the placement of the accent, and which set them apart from the rest of the paradigm. And Maiden then argues that first plural and second plural have no meaning in common, just like the passive and the perfect in Aronoff's case, and therefore form a morpheme. I think this is a result of poor analysis, just as in the case of Aronoff's work. So there's some more cases here, for instances from Italian. Verbs with the SC suffix have it in all forms except first plural and second plural. And in some instances, there's suppletions such that first plural and second plural have what you might call the unmarked variant, and the older marked variant occurs in the elsewhere environment, which is first, second, third, singular, and third plural. So instead of putting a label on these, I think what they call for is analysis. And as a Slavist, the first thing I do, of course, is think of Slavic languages and how the Slavic languages handle the first and second plural. And lo and behold, they form parallels to the ones in Romance. Paradigm A here is Common Slavic. Paradigm B shows the faithful historical development into Russian, which is a fairly conservative Slavic language. And you see the first plural and second plural are quite diverse. But when you go to Ukrainian, you can see that first and second plural differ from all the other person forms by having syllabic person markers. And they're not alone. Bulgarian, some varieties of Bulgarian have the same thing, and you find the same thing in Polish. In fact, we could extend this to Serbian, Croatian, Slovenian, Slovak, and Polish here is a representative of the whole Northwest, including the Sorbian languages, Kashubian and Polabian. The Slavic first-person plural endings don't have good phonological explanation. They have been created by morphological processes that have made the first plural and second plural more alike. So you wonder why languages would do this, or rather why speakers would do this. What is the affinity between first plural and second plural should be the question. And it seems to me that it's not a difficult question to answer. You have a first person singular and a second person singular that express the participants in the speech event. You have third persons, third singular and third plural, that express non-members of the speech event. And then you have, for example, the second person plural, which means the addressee plus one or more other people. And the first person plural means the speaker plus one or more other people. So they have a very complex reference, unlike first, second singular, and third singular and plural. And I would say it's this sort of semantic analysis that justifies their having developed similar expression. Now, of course, we can't be sure that the speakers who speak these languages today have this feeling of semantic justification for the forms, but one thing we can be sure of is that when these forms were created, they were motivated. That's the most we can say. More recently, some interesting forms from Marsala in Sicily have been brought to the market. You can look at them briefly, and you can see how interesting it is that first and second singular, third singular and third plural have the same construction. I go to fetch bread, you go to fetch bread, she goes to fetch bread. But that construction is not used for the first plural and the second plural. So there too, there's something odd about first person and second person plural, which is understood the moment you recognize that they have complex reference. You can speak for yourself, you can speak about others, but you cannot speak for yourself and others at the same time. So that's one example, I think, where the notion of morpheme stops the analysis in the tracks and doesn't help us gain a better understanding of language. There is another aspect of this which I would like to draw attention to, and that is the Saussurean doctrine of signifiant and signifié, which goes back to the Middle Ages, and which has been replaced in recent times in various grammatical frameworks by a different conception that sees the sign as a triple, comprising a content or exponendum, an exponent or expression, and then syntactic properties. This is expressed very explicitly in the Russian sense text grammar, and is actually referred to by Aronoff, and you see it in the work of Carstairs McCarthy, and most recently Spencer in 2016 has advocated an understanding of morphological signs that sees these three parts as significant. Assigned syntactic properties, as I point out here, defined indexes that link the sign to its context. There are content and expression indexes, and I would like to give you some examples here of expression indexes and their various functions. There are, for example, phonological indexes, and you will be familiar with the sort of examples here. The Finnish vowel harmony creates signs in decences that index the vocalism of the stem. Here's some examples of Slavic declensional forms, where in one paradigm, the allomorphs indicate the stem final palatal consonants. So you have two variant paradigms, and stems that have a final palatal consonant take endings that are a little different from the ones in words that don't have a final palatal. This sort of thing is found also in Romance languages You can see here that you have a longer stem in the first singular and first and third plural in Italian, also in the subjunctive. And if you buy the notion of morpheme, you would say this is a clear example of morpheme. A whole lot of forms that have nothing in common have the same allomorphy. But what they have in common is that the longer stems that end in a G always occur before a back vowel. And this way of having morphological alternations or morphophonemic alternations modified, conditioned by the environment, phonological environment, is not particularly rare. I give you here in paradigms A and B a difference between Late Common Slavic, which has a palatal consonant in the first singular before the first singular ending, and then the Old Polish corresponding paradigm, where the palatal consonant occurs in stem final, not only in the first singular but also in the third plural. What do the first singular and third plural have in common? They have in common an ending that begins with a nasal vowel. So what you have here is essentially what we call a reanalysis. The presence of the palatal consonants in Late Common Slavic, which occurs in the first person singular. The conditioning has been reanalyzed from morphological to phonological. So now the palatal occurs before nasal vowels. And a similar development is attested in Ukrainian with a slightly different group of consonants and with slightly different vowels. But in Ukrainian, what we call the grade 3, what I call the grade 3 mutation occurs now before back vowels in the second conjugation. That means it's been spread from the first singular to the third plural. And this can be understood only as a reanalysis, and there's no point in talking about this as the emergence of a morpheme. So here you have some examples of allomorphy indicating, serving as indexes of declensional classes. The ones in Latin are well known to everyone. The ones in Slavic, in Russian, are well known to all Slavists. You can tell by the ending what declension a noun belongs to. In some instances, you have indexes that indicate the morphological class. One class of verbs in Russian have the grade 3 mutation in the present tense, and also in the imperative. I don't have that there in the present tense. And another one have that alternation only in the first person singular and the third and the past passive participle. So you can have different kinds of grammatical conditioning. There's essentially nothing new in this, but what is new in it is that when you look at it, not as conditioning, but rather as indexing, you have a semiotic analysis of it that gives you a little better understanding of what is going on in the language. Here you have an example from recent literature of paradigm in Russian that sees a morpheme in the second, third singular and first and second plural of, this is a small class of verbs in Russian, maybe 50 verbs that have a root that ends in an obstruent. What this so-called morpheme tells me is that the analyst did not pay attention to the content of the endings, because in fact the U in the first person singular is specifically a first person marker. It occurs in almost all Russian verbs as a first person marker. That's to say, it belongs with the consonants sh, t in the second and third singular, m and ch and t in the third. And once you move it over there, you can see that the vowels that come between the stem and the person marker form a paradigm. So it's a paradigm of allomorphs, and they are grammatically conditioned. So we have here a 0 before the vowel U, and we have an U before the third person T, and then we have the O's in what you would call an elsewhere environment. One thing that's interesting about this, separating the vowels and from the person markers in the present tense, is that you can then get a parallel with the situation in the past tense, where there is an L that everyone who studies this language recognizes as a tense marker. And since you have a tense marker as a consonant in the past tense, you might wonder if the vowels that come between stem and person marker in the present wouldn't also be a tense marker. Looking at the gerund, you see that the gerund has a vowel in the present and a consonant marker in the past gerund. And so it looks as if the vowel that intervenes between stem and person marker in the present tense is a present tense marker. It's a funny distribution. Of course, it's hard to understand when you just look at it, but there it is. And it's better to describe it as a grammatical marker than to say that it is a piece of meaningless plaque in the middle of the morphology. Here's some examples from Russian dialects that have a slightly different distribution of vowels. Some dialects have then an O only in the first person plural. Some have an O in the plural, an E in the singular, and some have an E in the second person singular and plural, and an O in the third person singular and first person plural. This completely contravenes the structure that I observed in the Ukrainian and in the Italian examples. But there's nothing surprising in that. Languages have different structures for their person markers, for their person categories, and when they have morphological material, speakers are likely to redistribute them so that materials so that they have meaningful distribution. I think personally that the paradigm in paradigm D is a result of population movements. It is attested in the central areas of Russia, and probably is sort of a merger of speakers who had paradigm B and paradigm C. Be that as it may, some examples of lexical category indexes, and I then move forward to the question of what do morphological indexes buy us. I think, first of all, an understanding of the actual richness of morphological signs. Its content may comprise both an exponendum and one or more index values. Secondly, two less complex kinds of signs with a zero exponent and signs with a zero exponendum. And thirdly, a view of morphology that integrates it with the rest of grammar. Here's one of my standard examples of what sorting into indexes and exponenda gives you. The first example there is from Matthew's monograph, 1974. One of his arguments for giving up morpheme analysis and adopting a word and paradigm program, because the relationship between content and expression is so messy in languages such as this. And then when you write rules that are distinguish clearly between the content of the morphemes and their conditioning, you can see that there is a clear distinction between exponenda and index values. I will skip a very nice example of the historical development of indexes, and will not talk about zero exponenda, meaning interfixes, and zero exponents, meaning zero signs, but instead point out the isomorphism between morphology and the rest of language if you accept a distinction between exponenda and indexes. And I would like to point out that all of reference and implicatures relies on indexes. All of text coherence depends on text deixis, which is also based on indexes. Agreement in clauses depends on indexes, endophoric and exophoric. And also in morphology, we have endophoric and exophoric indexes. And in phonology, endophoric indexes were first detected as such in 1937, and exophoric features have been talked about for a long time as well. So recognizing the indexical value of morphological elements means integrating morphology with the rest of language. I would like to have spoken a little more about the role of indexes in historical morphology, from synchronic description to diachronic explanation. Unfortunately, there wouldn't be time for that here. One question you might say, what you might ask is, what do these languages show that we can use in languages of other types? Now, it's clear that both Russian and Italian, the examples I've given my examples from, are fusional languages. Actually, the Slavic languages are fusional languages that are gradually looping back into an agglutinative structure. But I think it is possible to, it will be possible to, if I could move this, there we are. It will be possible to extend this analysis to languages of other types, both polysynthetic and what you call symbolic in type. And I'm going to look at that and may be able to refer back to you, report back to you at the next conference in Canberra. And in my approach to this, I will follow the guiding principle of Karl Bühler, Sprachtheorie, 1934, one of the fathers of social linguistics. Everything in language is semiotic. And that will be the end for today.
Thank you. Your timing was impeccable. I didn't even have to tell you to stop.
I'm sorry.
No. So we have a few minutes for questions. There are microphones around somewhere. Henning, do you want to recognize people yourself? Or have they call on?
There would be someone.
Livio.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Actually, I have a question relating, well, not only to the Italian examples, but more in general to the logic of the argumentation. In the sense that it's clearly the case for the Italian examples you showed us that they are the result of phonological change, in the sense that the allomorphy is phonologically based diachronically, in the sense that only stressed vowel might undergo diphthongization. This is the reason why you have this alternation with siedo and sediamo, okay? And your argument is that this is clearly the origin of the alternation. And the argument goes that when this happened because of phonology, then there has been a reorganization of the system, according to which the semiotic indexization or the semiotic reanalysis took over, and then we have now a system which is semiotically organized according to the principle that first and second person plural are kept together by some semantic or semiotic motivation against the other persons of the verb. Is this your way? Because on the other hand, the morphomic way is simply that this is purely the result of case, namely phonological change leading to reorganization of the paradigms according to the form that you've got as a consequence of phonological change. So do you think that the semiotic reorganization, semiotic remotivation of the system is always necessary or not? This is actually the issue.
Well, it's clear that there's a phonological origin in the Romance languages of this special case where the first and second person go together. But it's clear also that in the Romance languages that the phonological conditioning has been given up. And this is clear from the redistribution of suppletive morphs, as in andare, or in French, je vais, tu vas, il va, nous allons, vous allez. So I think that at that time, the reason that took place is that the phonologically conditioned alternations were reanalyzed as grammatically conditioned. And what is it that makes the first and second person similar? That is their meaning. So it's at that time that the indexing of first and second plural is motivated. Whether it is still motivated, I don't know. We always assume that whatever is there is motivated. But the most we can claim is that when it was created, it was motivated. And we cannot create that the phonological conditioning was anything except phonological if it hadn't been for those redistributions of suppletive morphs. So I think sometime in the Middle Ages when we got the difference between esco and usciamo, that was the structure. And the same thing goes for the Russian examples. One can see in the Russian case, in the Slavic case, in the Middle Ages, the first singular and first plural of athematic verbs became identical. At that time, the athematic first plural, it was convenient to use some sort of an allomorph, and we don't really know how it happened. And that then spread to all the other, to the thematic verbs. So why did it spread? Why did it become generalized in the whole system? Presumably because it was semantically motivated. And I think if we could just get away from the numbering of persons the way we've gotten away from the numbering of cases, it would be clear that languages have different structures, different ways of organizing their participant categories, as I would call them. Anyway, so that was a long answer. Thank you.
I think we're actually out of time, so thank our speaker for...
Okay.
Minutes, we will have, in 8 minutes, we'll have the beginning of a small organized session on Henning himself and his work. So please stay or come back.
How do you get this out?
That was great.
Yeah.
Almost all of what you said.
You agree with almost all of it. Then it was great. How do I do this? Inside. Okay. Control save. And then I can go over here. go in here. Hi. I'm trying to get rid of this.
Yes. So we can.
In theory, I guess I could just pull this out. In theory.
It worked.
It worked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I hope you'll stick around.
What?
I hope you'll stick around.
Well, yeah, we'll see. I think we should have a smaller room, but we don't have a
Yeah,
small
no, I know, it's kind of weird.
Yeah.
But
Uh,
it'll seem diffuse.
yeah.
I've signed mine. Yeah, yeah. But the others on the panel, I guess you did. Would you like more from Tokyo?
Well, I mean, I'm a student of Gustav Wurzel, so in this sense, I'm rather on the natural morphology side. So I like the idea of having iconicity and motivation everywhere. More meaning, more form. But on the other hand, it's also true that some internal movements of morphological systems are purely morphological in nature. So the system and ecosystem which I like very much as an idea, because a system must have some inner organization.
Can you help me find the disc that I've mounted here? Can you help me find the disc that I've mounted here?
It's semiotic relating to the whole system, which has a shape. And this shape makes the system manageable by the speaker. For instance, associated words. And in case of the Italian examples,
Sorry, my desktop
this
looks
is
like
one.
I know where they go.
That's why I asked. I figured you would
Like
see what's.
this example, because it's a clear example.
Maybe we'll just get to it with the finder instead.
The result of a morphological change, which has created a shape, which seems to be quite convenient for the speakers. And this is the reason why it has been extended by Chronicle, independent of the semiotic of first, second person plural.
Why is it convenient?
It's probably convenient because it allows to group together the single persons of the paradigms, not simply as a list, but as a group of forms. And this is the result of phonology.
But then, in order to say that it's convenient for the speakers, you have to say that it's meaningless.
Not necessarily. I mean,
And that's the point. The point of the
yeah,
whole...
but you're talking about meaning in terms of reference, which is not always the case.
No,
I mean, I intend meaning or semiotic in sense of system organization principle.
No, I didn't mean that. I mean meaningless in the sense that it makes no sense. And then, to show that it does make sense, you can say it has meaning. If it has meaning, it makes sense. If it has no meaning, it's senseless. It is morphology by itself. And so, in that sense, when I say it's meaningless, I understand meaningless is ambiguous.
Yeah. But the focus on the system organization principles, for me, it's important. In the sense that, because I don't like these realizational approaches, they are very popular now, correct stamps, stuff. They are very, very popular. And they are completely arbitrary. And I don't like this
They're
simply
usually for
because,
historical linguistics.
yeah, but I don't like these approaches simply because they make a principal distinction between inflection and
That's Dan's, yes.
because they mean, well, inflection is syntactically motivated, so there are categories, and they are the result of implementation of features, which is in a way true, but in the other way, inflectional morphology is part of morphology, namely deals with signs.
Yes.
Signs are the combination of form and meaning.
Let me just say, we're not going to be able to find this out.
No, you won't be able to see it.
I always come back to the speakers. And when you say that some structure is more convenient for the speakers, I have to say, when did the speakers make that structure and why? So, I mean, it has to be used.
Oh, we're getting a Skype call now here.
What's that? Oh,
The
good.
system is also the result of different forces. I mean, phonological change
Dan.
responds to morphology in a massive way.
Hey, how are you?
Unfortunately, that's broad
You can see me?
I told you I was.
No, oh, let me,
That's all right. Yeah, we should talk more.
Yeah, absolutely.
I need to turn on the sound.
Yeah, can you send the sound out the headphones?
Yeah, I guess it does. But
I'm not sure
for
if that's
me,
a
it was
Skype
very
setting
important to show that morphology is not something by itself. The morphological system is like the rest of language. Exophone and endophone sounds.
Fuse morphology now still claims that morphology is not arbitrary in a strict sense. You might have deviation, but there is no language in the world in which you express the plural as a subtractive morpheme systematically. The singular is subtractive systematically with respect to the plural. And this is
Can you say something?
Dan, say something.
well, it's easy because I was
We're not hearing you. Hang on. No, it's not, we need to get the settings.
very important inflection morphology. Is that the case that
Keep talking for me if you could. I assume you can hear me okay.
Yes, I hear you fine now. It was muted before. But can you hear me? I'm still talking. So if you can hear me, my talk today is about the treatment of the Indo-European syllabic sonorants in Proto-Slavic, and I'm sitting here. I'm fully dressed, despite appearances. I realize I could be sitting here with no pants on, but no one would know. I can't see you at all, audience, so I don't have to really fear you. I'm only.
which have to be filled up
Brian, there's a reflection in your glass.
reflectional features, or you might have more general definition of paradigm in terms of
Yes,
Hi, I'm Gabriella.
how do you do?
Good.
Good to meet you. Yeah.
We just wanted to double check the names of the two speakers who are Skyping in.
Yeah.
Who was it?
It's Dan Collins and Keiko Mitani.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay.
to the fact that inflectional paradigms cannot be systematic.
No,
Always.
because they're all
Yeah.
archaic ones and old ones that are unproductive.
Not
Some
only, I mean, you cannot build the primitive form of I don't know, of leaf. Leaf.
Here I am again. Can you hear me?
Dan, you need to do video.
Well, thank you for your question.
I can't hear you now. Can you hear me? Hi, Matoki.
Don't go away or something.
Can you see me?
Dan, are you there?
I'm there. Can you see me?
No. No, but could you click your video icon and then I think we'll be all set.
Can you see me now?
Yes, perfect. And we
Can you hear me now?
Boy, we can hear you like crazy.
How many people are there
Oh, maybe 200 or so.
in the room?
Oh, yeah. No, in the room we have about 20.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody.
So are you going to be talking to him or mostly will?
Let's see.
So if you're not going to be talking, my preference would be you muted so we don't get this feedback.
Okay, no, I'm going to.
So this one's muted.
Okay.
That'll prevent.
Brian, you're muted again. I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. But we're going to keep our side muted as long as you're talking and not talking to you.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, if you want to unmute it so we can hear and then you can mute it again. All right, so go ahead and lay this out the way that you're.
So.
That's great.
And it's not showing on the screen.
All right. So one downside here is it's going to change the resolution, so it's not going to be quite as super good.
There's the thing where you need to drag.
It hasn't actually detected
Will you give me the thumbs up when, a signal like thumbs up when it's time for me to start?
Yes.
Okay. You'll give me an okay signal when it's time to start.
So my one concern is if I'm going to use him, so he can hear the introduction. I don't know how we're going to remute it. It's not going to
Isn't that right?
we, not go. You know what I'm trying to say? I don't want it to not go into presenter view.
That's where you can see the next slide. But they only see one, so that would be.
Right, but this won't be, I guess you can drag that over. Will that work?
Yeah, he was.
I don't think he was on there. Try it again.
Would it be easier for me to speak by cell phone?
No, we're okay. Oh. We're okay, Dan.
Yeah. Okay.
Try dragging him over to the other screen. So it's on one of the sides. Nope, not there. Try
Can you see Dan?
Yeah, keep sliding.
More? Is he there? Hey, all right.
A little more.
A little more? Oh, that's about as far as I can go. A little up? I can't find him now. I've lost him.
Can you, maybe you can see on this right screen better?
He's on the edge. He's on the big screen? Oh, but he's in the way. Is that the? Well, why don't we move it over to the just attention?
The audience would be relieved if you couldn't see me altogether.
So I think this is where we're going to be.
Okay.
This is the options.
I think that if you could slide it over a little more so we don't see his, yeah, a little more. That's fine. There we see his head, and just his head. And you could pull it up a bit.
It won't go up.
Oh, that's his floor. Okay. All right. Okay, I guess we're ready.
All right. So yeah, he wanted a thumbs up on the.
And now I don't know how to do the muting. Oh well.
You don't need to mute.
Well, thank you all for coming, or staying, as the case may be. This is the result of a joint, a collaborative effort between my university, the Ohio State University, and Hokkaido University, Japan. This is Motoki Namachi. We organized this panel together, as I say, to express our interest in collaborating trans-Pacifically, and more specifically, to honor our good friend and colleague Henning Anderson, whom we have the utmost respect for. And this, we thought, would be a way of building on his excellent plenary and provide some insights into the kinds of work that he's done over the years. So we'll start with a presentation by Dan Collins of The Ohio State University on the Slavic reflexes of PIE syllabic sonorants. Does one size fit all? It'll be a bit, he'll be speaking and I'll be clicking to move things along. Go for it, Dan.
Go for it. All right, go to slide 2.
What did he say?
Slide 2.
Slide 2.
I want to thank the organizers, my friends and colleagues, Brian, Joseph, and and Matoki for this, and to the organizers of ITCHL for allowing me to speak, even though I am only virtually present. It's rather odd speaking by Skype. The first time I've done it at a conference. I do want to assure you, although it would be perfectly possible since I'm at home for me to be sitting here undressed, I am fully dressed, and I'm wearing fuzzy bunny slippers. Most of all, I'm very sad not to be present because I would have liked to have congratulated and thanked in person my teacher, Henning Anderson, and who, although I'm making a counter proposal to some of his ideas, every aspect of my own thinking on the subject has been influenced by his ideas. I was not my doctoral advisor. I already had a relationship with another advisor when Henning came to UCLA in the late 1980s. But I can say without any doubt that I learned more about Slavic linguistics and linguistics in general and about how to think about language from Henning than from any of my other professors in the history of my education, although I had all of them were excellent. Being in class with Henning and talking with Henning always was a remarkably stimulating, exhilarating experience. It's true that you had to learn how to speak with him, and I was an earnest, I think a little bit overly serious young man. I didn't have any gray hair or beard at the time, but it took me a while to get used to his puckish sense of humor. I remember one time asking Professor Anderson, as he was walking by in the department office, Professor Anderson, may I have an appointment with you? To which he replied, yes, and continued to walk on without pausing to make the appointment. Of course, he gave me the appointment very generously, and he was smiling at the time. I did come back with the idea that we were in a Gricean situation, but I really am grateful to him for so many things. It was a chance remark of his in the Xerox room in the department office that led to my discovery of my dissertation topic. And since that time, if you proceed to the next slide, Brian. In the last 2 years, I was engaged in writing a phonological history going from Proto-Slavic through Common Slavic, and I realized in researching for that chapter the incredible contribution that Henning Anderson has made to our understanding of Slavic historical linguistics and phonology in particular. He is cited much more than any other author in the course of that chapter. And in this slide and in the next slide, it just gives some of his contributions, some of his works that deal with historical phonology of Slavic. Not, I think, a complete list, but these are monumental and revolutionary contributions. Now, the particular problem that I wanted to discuss is one that Henning Anderson himself touched on in his classic article, Diphthongization in Language in 1972, and returned to in his book, Reconstructing Prehistoric Dialects in 1996, and in a 2003 article entitled Slavic and the Indo-European Migrations. And this is the problem of the vowel that appears in Slavic and in Baltic before the reflexes of Proto-Indo-European sonorants the syllabic L, R, M, and N. So we're on the next slide, Brian. So, of course, as is well known, sonorants were syllabic when there was no adjacent vowel and non-syllabic elsewhere. And next slide. In Slavonic, as in Baltic, and in some of the other Indo-European languages, the syllabic sonorants developed what are called often anaptictic or epenthetic or prothetic vowels. Now, the mechanism for this it was explained in an article, one of the articles, along with abductive and deductive change, which is, I think, radically formed my own thinking about phonological change. In his article, Diphthongization, Anderson notes it's natural for learners of a language to introduce phonetic innovations consisting of a heterogeneous implementation of some feature value which defines a segment, and for other speakers of the language to find such deviations from the received pronunciation acceptable. On the other hand, it explains how it is possible for learners of a language to interpret sequential diphthongs as realizations of single segments, synchronically diphthongized with respect to some specific feature. So, in next slide. Anderson explains the mechanism of what was called epenthesis. When a syllabic sonorant is diphthongized, the onset of its consonantal properties is delayed, and its initial portion becomes vowel-like. If the syllabic sonorant undergoes phonemic diphthongization, its initial portion will be identified with some specific vowel phoneme. And Anderson gives the example, proceed, Brian, of Russian initial sonorant consonant clusters like Zhanoy, Lanoy, and Mshisti. Next slide. Now, in Slavic, the difficulty is that the vowel that appears before the reflexes of the Proto-Indo-European sonorants can be either E or U. And I've given examples of all four sonorants, each of which has one or other outcome. And the diphthongizations, of course, as shown in the next slide, similar twofold outcomes occur in Baltic, so often in the same root. So most scholars have posited that this is a shared development. Now, I'm not going to be discussing Baltic here. This may be a dubious decision on my part, but I view Balto-Slavic as in the late Proto-European dialectal period as a dialect continuum, and I worry about the danger of a priori assumptions. In dealing, for instance, with Slavic accentology, you see a certain tyranny of Baltic accent. It's assumed that if the accentual innovation is seen in Lithuanian, that it also should occur for the entire Balto-Slavic group. And this, of course, is really not the case. So in this problem as well, I'd prefer to account for Slavic diversity in the reflexes independently, and some other project would have to deal with the Baltic diversity and then compare the results. Next slide. So the problem, as stated by Lunt, is that scholars have not discovered the conditions that determined whether E or U was selected in the epenthesis process. And indeed, this has been rather mind-boggling. If we go to the next slide, unclear phonological conditioning, in a far from complete sample in Shivalyov's book, Prehistory of Slavic, we see of his 86 Slavic items, 62% have E and 38 have U, but there's no clear phonological patterning. And next slide. Anderson in 2003, in a much, much larger sample of 215 lexemes shared by Baltic and Slavic, notes that 73% have only E, 17% have only U, and the rest have either both reflexes in the same root or different reflexes, E in Slavic and U in Baltic, or vice versa. Now, next slide. In the interest of time, I'm going to gloss over the actual Slavic attested reflexes. Most of the Slavic evidence can only come from two of the subgroupings, Lahidic and East Slavic. And this is because, next slide, in Southern dialects, which consist of South Slavic and Czechoslovak, I'm calling these Ciscarpathian because I think at the time of the innovation, they were the dialects beyond, from the European point of view, within the Carpathian Mountains, as opposed to Lahidic to the north and East Slavic to the east. But they had a merger of these. They had new syllabic sonorants formed by the monophthongization process, that is the mirror image of the diphthongization in Anderson's approach. So the reflexes, although they may have been spelled in medieval texts in Old Church Slavonic, Old Serbian, Old Croatian with yer letters, with vowel letters, they actually, that's a pure orthographic convention, and the modern Bulgarian reflexes, which have a schwa on one or other side of the sonorant, are in fact later developments. In the next slide, and we find the East Slavic reflexes, and here there was a merger as well, which obscures the reflexes before L. So in fact, Lahidic gives us the best sources, but it is often limited evidence. So in the next slide, the summary of the reflexes of Proto-European syllabic L and R in Slavic. I don't know whether in fact this is a central versus peripheral division, but it seems to me that what I call the Ciscarpathian type could be viewed as a central innovation, and then on the peripheries, these are the peripheries in the perhaps 6th century of the Common Era, you find the Proto-Slavic and for most of Common Slavic, those diphthongs. Next slide. So there have been 3 approaches to the epenthetic vowel split in Slavic. The first says that both E and U are phonologically regular. And so it then becomes necessary to explain the conditioning. The second states that only E is phonologically regular, and then primarily explains the others as exceptions due to extension of either the front vowel or the back vowel in an ablaut series. And the third is that the inherited reflex is E, and that U is primarily the result of language contact. And this is the approach seen in Anderson 2003, and it's the only viable one of the existing explanations, I think. So in approach 1, next slide, which states that both E and U are phonologically regular, this is associated with Vaillant, Kortlandt, Bakes, and Dirksen, for instance. The Vaillant approach states that you get the U reflex before, or after, excuse me, labiovelars. And then the various exceptions, the various and numerous exceptions, are explained as expressive words, as onomatopoetic words, as loan words, or as extension of the the vowel ablaut type, with E being associated with the grade. So next slide. If we look at the issues with this approach, we have what I think is an anachronism, a serious one, which is the fact that delabialization is not a late Balto-Slavic change. It was shared with other Satan languages, and so it should be older than epenthesis. There is, secondly, a huge number of when we're dealing with some 215 roots, there are many counterexamples, and these are not explainable by expressive usage, onomatopoesis often. Some of them are, and it's doubtful that they can have other explanations. So in the next slide, there's a second variant on this approach that states that you get the or reflex after the merged reflex of velars and labiovelars, and this is Kotowowicz's approach. You have exceptions based on besides expressives and onomatopoeia, you have extensions based on ablaut grades, ablaut associations. So E would be associated with E grade, and U would be associated with O grade, and could be extended there. Now the next slide, issues with Kotowowicz's approach. The problems here are essentially the same as the problems for Vaillant's approach. There's massive analogy going on, and there are many counter examples. And in particular, we can point to roots that have doublets, like the root skrp, where you find the same root with both reflexes, both the E reflex and the U reflex, as in Old East Slavic skrba and szczerbina. All right, so if we skip now, Brian, slides to Matasovic. The most recent phonological explanation, that regularity-based explanation that I'm aware of in 2004 is interesting and much more nuanced than the earlier ones. It states essentially that the E reflexes can always be analogical. In fact, whereas you can look primarily at the distribution of the U reflexes and get the proper distribution. So in the next slide, it has been suggested that we have non-initial syllables have E, and initial syllables have E or U, depending on a regular phonological environment. And the usual factors can be blamed in the next slide, and in particular, extensions of the E grade for the exceptions. Now, next slide. One of the things that I see often in the studies is that a lot of the evidence is dismissed if it's Slavic only, and this is certainly a feature of the article that I was just discussing, and I see this as a general methodological problem. Although I can be corrected. I'd like to be if I'm wrong, but the basic idea is that as the time depth of the reconstructed lexeme is uncertain, it may not be Proto-Slavic and we can ignore it. And certainly that is a sound assumption, except it seems to me that it runs the risk of eliminating evidence that may well be common Slavic. And so what it seems to me is that we're dismissing the conservative assumption. Be that as it may, the Matasevich approach, I see other problems if we look at the next slide. Besides the burden that's placed on analogy to Ablaut, I would note here that this is happening at a time, in Slavic at least, where Ablaut is becoming less productive in most respects. The second problem is the fact that a lot of the discussion depends on nasal diphthongs, and they're actually completely ambiguous with respect to whether they're zero grade or full grade in Slavic due to nasal monophthonizations. And then the split between non-initial syllables and initial syllables as a phonological factor troubles me. There are only 3 examples cited for the non-initial syllables, which strikes me as being rather few. And I note that non-initial syllables is construed here as non-prefixed only. So prefixation is ignored. We don't know when it happened, of course, but it is assuming that it is later. And we can see, in fact, lots of cases. I've cited the instance of outcomes of the root Dirk, pull, in East Slavic to illustrate the fact, in fact, we can have the reflex in non-initial syllables. We don't know the time depth of these words, admittedly. But in general, I'm wondering what the phonological basis is for the outcome to be distinct in non-initial and initial syllables. Yes. Yes, I'm here. How many minutes? None? Yeah. Okay. So Anderson's approach, Brian, can you go to slide? Approach 3 is that order arose primarily through language contact. And this explains data very adequately. It's an Indo-European contact either with Germanic or with a pre-Satem dialect. And once is established in the system, then it's available to Proto-Slavic or pre-Slavic speakers to be extended in different ways. Now, I have some issues which I don't have to talk about with some of the reasoning that comes from an earlier approach by Stang. But if we skip to slide 41. I want to suggest as an alternative proposal that that contact is undoubtedly an issue, but that to some extent the variant outcomes are to be expected due to the ambiguous phonetic realizations of syllabic sonorants, and that messy outcomes are to be expected due to the social process involved in the spread of the innovation. The next slide. Like English, German, Czech, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, and the off-cited Tashkent Berber, we find that the syllabic sonorants are often produced with vocoids in their opening and closing phases. And moreover, that the vocoids often are quite variable perceptually. That is, speakers don't perceive them altogether. But they can actually be in quite a range, depending on the speed of speech the adjacent consonants, and other factors. And now if we skip to slide 45, Brian. My alternative proposal is simply that vowel epenthesis in Proto-Slavic is not a sound change proper, but a phonemic reanalysis. And so here we have the classic Andersenian abductive and deductive change scenario. The model has an ambiguous output where the vocoid or vowel before the syllabic sonorant can probably have a range of phonetic positions. The innovative learners learn this clearly as a vowel plus a sonorant. And the innovative results under this scenario need not, for a given learner, have one vowel quality. There can be influence of adjacent consonants, of phonesthetics, input from other languages in a bilingual community. So to next slide, lots of the innovations are flying under the radar. Innovative speakers have internalized the vowel, the high vowel sonorant rather than syllabic sonorant, and they're going to be likely to implement it more frequently, which leads to increased frequency of the vocalized reflexes in the speech community. The innovations are going to pass mostly unnoticed by conservative speakers because of phonetic proximity and the variation in their own syllabic sonorants as well. But conservative speakers are going to be inclined not to perceive the forms with the high vowel R as grammatical mistakes for the simple reason that they don't have high vowel R in their grammars. They're going to be constrained to continue to hear whatever the schwa is as a syllabic sonorant. Next slide. Yeah. Yes. So essentially, I'm suggesting that the change can have heterogeneous results because of the nature of syllabic sonorants, and with the fallout from this in within the speech community later, we can see a certain randomization. In other words, I'm proposing that contact and the adjacent sounds can all be factors, but that we should expect a certain messiness due to the nature of how syllabic sonorants are perceived. And thank you.
I'm afraid we're going to have to pass on questions, Dan, but thank you for this very enlightening presentation. I think you've solved the problem, and with a bit of help working from Henning's starting point. So we'll now move on to the next paper. I'm sorry about the timing, but the next paper is by me and Hope Dawson on Henning, of course. How to get out of this? Okay. This. I think so. Do you know where my? Want to get rid of? So long, Dan. So long. Here we go. Slideshow view. Slideshow. Yeah. It's at the wrong point. Here we go. Yeah, so the title, Dichotomies of Change, Where to Draw the Lines, If at All. We'll try to make this quick. Our point of departure, some ideas contained in Henning's well-known paper, Abductive and Deductive Change. Just in case you were wondering, it is the most cited paper of his, 821 citations in Google Scholar, with coming from works of all over the linguistic map. He talks about abduction and deduction there. It's in the title. 3 different modes of inference that are crucial to language change. We won't go through the the details here. Because the paper is actually about more than just abduction and deduction, it makes an important contribution to Slavic and especially Czech linguistics through its discussion of the sound change of a sharpened P, a P to T in some dialects of Czech. The abduction-deduction dichotomy, it's attracted considerable attention, but it's not our focus here. Rather, there's another dichotomous dimension that Henning brings to light. In the presentation of the Czech change, he introduces two ways of characterizing the relevant developments. The changes in question, did I miss a slide? No. The changes in question are an earlier regular, purely phonetically conditioned sound change of sharpened P, P to T in some dialects, but P to P in other dialects as part of a general depalatalization in Czech. And a later lexically particular shift in the T dialects of T to P after contact between the dialect groups, with the P speakers representing the socially and economically dominant dialect. And he saw these two types of changes as fundamentally different. The first was driven entirely by linguistic factors, in this case acoustic phonetic conditioning, and he called this evolutive. The second is driven by social factors, and he referred to this as adaptive. And this is the dichotomy that we're interested in here. Evolutive change is a change entirely explainable in terms of the linguistic system that gave rise to it, system internal developments, that is. Adaptive change is a change that is not explainable without reference to factors outside the linguistic system in question. So it's a system external basis for the change, seeing the changes embedded in a larger social structure. They both involve abductive and deductive reasoning as it happens. The metaphor behind these terms seems to be that with evolutive change, a language, almost like an organism, undergoes changes that are the result of its own internal structure and constraints. Whereas with adaptive change, the language, or better, we should say the speakers, accommodate their usage to the usage of others in order to avoid being socially stigmatized. This terminology thus recognizes a key distinction in our understanding of language change, the dichotomy between internal and external change, or better, internally motivated versus externally motivated change. And it reflects the fact that language is both a psychological, cognitive, individual phenomenon and a social or interactional phenomenon. This has been recognized elsewhere. Eric Hamp has observed that the comparative method, which represents the results of internal changes, and areal linguistics, which represents the results of geographic contiguity and thus contact, are complementary and not competing, what he calls the twin faces of diachronic linguistics, two key ways of elucidating sources of historical similarities and differences between languages. That is, we can only understand what is due to contact by having a clear picture of what's inherited, and conversely, to determine what's inherited, we have to rule out contact-related similarities. We find the distinction that Henning draws between evolutive and adaptive change to be insightful and important. We've employed it productively and very usefully in introductory linguistics classes. So our goal here in this paper is to explore how this concept has fared in the years since it was proposed, especially in the light of other terms that have been proposed. And surprisingly, it has not gotten as much attention as we expected.
So one thing that perhaps played an issue with this is the framework in which the paper was written. So we do note that Anderson explicitly embedded this distinction in the then current generative phonology framework. So in particular, he speaks of A rules or adaptive rules and I rules or implementation rules, I rules being a reflex of the grammar of evolutive change. And so we do wonder if this particular generative nature tied these terms in particular to generativism, which kept it from being extended to other frameworks as they might otherwise have been. So for example, noting a quite influential paper that followed, Ohala's Listeners of Sources Sound Change, this focus on the important role of the listener in sound change and due in particular to the ambiguity of the acoustic signal that seems to echo in some of its aspects some of Anderson's concerns. So Ohala notes that the acoustic speech signal is inherently ambiguous with respect to its articulation, so the listener isn't always able to resolve the ambiguity and may hit on an articulation different from that used by other speakers. And Anderson had noticed the ambiguous character of the acoustic manifestations. If they're not analyzed correctly by the listener, they would be interpreted differently. And so the source of abductive innovations is found in distributional ambiguities in a verbal output from which the new grammars infer. It's the same talking about the acoustic and ambiguities which result in some of these changes. But Ohala does explicitly note that when he talks about the listener applying reconstructive rules in sorting out this ambiguity, they crucially depend on his having correctly perceived the environment causing the distortion. But he does note that by using the term rule here, I do not mean to put the listener's reconstructive process into the same category as rules posited by traditional generative phonology and its offshoots. So potentially that played a role in his using slightly different, or not explicitly referencing Anderson's work in this area. So we did do a basic survey of some introductory works on historical linguistics, including some handbooks. And a few do list Anderson 1973 in the bibliography, but many do not. Some include discussion of the Czech data in particular, this particular sound change. Others have mentions of abduction and deduction as important processes in sound change and linguistic development in general. Only one seems to mention evolutive and adaptive, McMahon's introductory book. And another, Janda and Joseph, in their introduction to the handbook, do mention adaptive rules in that introduction as well. Adaptive and adaptation, so general searches for these terms do bring up lots of hits in linguistics and elsewhere, but they're much more commonly used. Evolutive in particular is much more of a rare term. It doesn't seem to have the same play as evolution, of course, which is a hugely common term across many fields. But one thing to note is that sometimes when you do run into usages of adaptive change in historical linguistics or in linguistics in general, which might seem to be the same as Anderson's, but are not actually, even if they do appear at first glance. So one we noticed was in Dahl's work on the complexity of grammar. He draws a distinction between two major types of change, which he names as neo-grammarian sound change, which is classical sound laws, and then adaptive sound change, so sound change that hits certain expressions as response to acquiring new niches or being used more often. So at first glance, this does seem to be similar to the type of internal, external, or the evolutive versus adaptive changes Anderson references. But the more you go through and look at what he's referring to here, he talks about sound change and lexical diffusion. So a grammarian change might start out as adaptive sound change, and talking about other aspects of how he defines this neo-grammarian sound change, and then looking into what he defines as the causal mechanisms behind adaptive sound change. He sees it as driven by redundancy and prominence management, or reaction to change role of expression. So adaptive phonetic reduction is response to decrease in informational or rhetorical value of the expression. So there doesn't really seem to be a good connection with Anderson's usages here, even though at first sight it might seem to be similar. So because of the breadth of these terms, they do have several differences in the way they are used. But evolutive and adaptive are used since then, of course. As I note, they are cited quite often in the general literature. And particularly in some recent works by some in the socio-historical field. So in Hinskin's Hour and Kurzweil's recent book, or within the last 10 years or so, on dialectal convergence and divergence. In their introduction to that work, they make reference to general internal versus external factors in the actuation of sound change, and adding extra-linguistic factors to external, and of course mention all the various aspects of that, both social, political, economic, and also social, psychological, identities and attitudes, just similar to what talks about prestige in Anderson's work. And then they do cite Anderson's work. It is slightly later, but also citing the definitions from 1973, adaptive, evolutive, and spontaneous innovations, and noting that the adaptive innovations are externally motivated, and then the evolutive and spontaneous evolutions internally motivated. So this is one area where these works are referenced. And again, noting that also in other subtypes, so contact-induced innovation, special type of adaptive innovation affecting differences between language systems, and abductive innovation, so they also bring in abductive and as a major aspect of this, a special type of evolutive innovation, typically affecting differences in a single system. And again, referencing the fact of incorrect analysis of primary language data as being an important part of how these changes are brought about, motivated by the laws of language. So this is one recent work, and some other recent works or people who've been mentioning this. So Tagliamonte and Darcy in the paper in Adolescence and Incrementation of Change talked about when they were discussing what they found, their results, the provocative question of why do phonological changes generally have a peak in apparent time for women only, while discourse-chromatic and morphosemantic syntactic changes consistently have peaks for females and males. And they do note that one of all the various possibilities that they list as things to look into, they note that possibilities of focus on the nature of change itself, not just with respect to speed or point of change, but also with respect to origin, inside or outside the community, and its nature and type. So explicitly referencing evolutive or adaptive from Anderson, and then making this parallel too with transmitted or diffused, more recently by Labov in 2007, as we've also heard about. And then in a more recent paper than on the variability and talking about the vernacular grammar in general, they do bring a lot of these different terms together and explicitly connect the evolutive and adaptive with some of the more recent terminology, including Labov's and others. So change from below or from within is a normal type of internal change originating within the linguistic system. Because the activation is internal, change from below is evolutive, which means it's explicable with reference to the community-based linguistic system. It emerges from the inherited structure of grammatical systems, adult-to-child transmission, remember Labov. This is a systematic change, initially unconscious. So above and below are partially defined along continuum of consciousness. The key attribute of change from below is the point of actuation, the system eternal, and the trajectory of development, so evolutive. So internal and evolutive with change from below. And then also bring in endogenous and exogenous, which are other terms used in this area. So although the etiology of endogenous change is discernible with reference to the language internal factors only, the diffusion of change in social context must be motivated by speaker-based factors. So change originates in speakers, not languages. So distinction between the conditions that give rise to it, the change, and those having to do with this diffusion. So as this innovation moves from speaker to speaker or from group to group, its diffusion is exogenous, propelled by influences outside the community group, what Anderson refers to as adaptive. So again, making this explicit connection between this diffusion across groups, adaptive change, and exogenous change. So again, just continuing to make these connections across, again, involving prestige in the adaptive change or spreading across. So the changes being adaptive and actuation, so language external mechanism working together with language internal mechanism to propel the new forms into written language, which again, very much similar to what Anderson was referring to in his original work with the interaction of these two types of change. Do you want to wrap up?
Yeah. So we have these terminological dichotomies, internal versus external is sort of the general cover term for all of this. We have Anderson's evolutive and adaptive. We go E-crazy with Henning's last name and it being S-E-N. Transmission versus diffusion, that's Labov's term, and then endogenous, exogenous, which we're not sure exactly where it comes from. We know that it's quite common in social science usage, and it's maybe filtering into linguistics from there. There are some subtle differences that we detect here. Adaptive seems to be more agentively focused and also more individually focused, whereas diffusion seems to be more community focused, as we would expect from a Labovian term. Evolutive seems more system focused, and transmission seems more process focused. So there are some differences there that maybe we can consider. But we must also think about whether it must be a dichotomy. We have in mind cases of what we could call enhancement of tendencies that are present in a language due to contact, as with the spread, for instance, of evidentiality marking into Balkan Slavic under Turkish influence, which accentuated existing characteristics emerging in the languages at the time. This is Victor Friedman's analysis of the history of evidentiality in Macedonian and Bulgarian. And more, And more generally, we wonder about cases of multiple causation that Sally Thomason brought to our attention yesterday, for instance. And even more generally, by way of conclusion, maybe even though we have spent all this time on terminology, maybe we should not be so hung up on terminology and focus on the concepts behind the terms. So thank you very much, and thank you, Henning. And I think we're back on time. Yes, amazing. So we have a few minutes for questions. Excellent, if there are any. Henning, yes.
Regarding the last statement there, let me mention that in the most recent things I've been writing, I talk about endogenous and
Oh, you do?
and exogenous. Yes.
With exactly those terms.
Yeah. Well, yes. And I don't know how to defend the word adaptive. I thought at the time that it was a good word.
Yeah.
And I think now that it is a good word. And some other people apparently think so too. So now should I go back to using it?
Hope.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, what got us started in on this paper was the fact that we both thought that this is such a wonderful way of viewing things, and we were shocked to find that it hasn't gotten the attention that we thought it should.
Well, as I noted, in his own handbooks, he doesn't actually reference
Yes,
it as
yes,
much.
I'm as guilty as anyone. And most of the references to your paper were with regard, the 73 paper were with regard to abduction and deduction, not with regard to evolutive and adaptive. Yeah. So we can, yeah, question.
This is perhaps not a good question or more like a comment, but I just here it was about the consciousness or unconsciousness and how the language contact means conscious adapting. And I myself, I study the Sami languages, and North Sami is under influence, in Finnish side, it's the under influence of the majority language Finnish, and in the Norwegian side, it's under influence of Norwegian language. And it has affected, these majority languages have affected to the pronunciation of the language, the Sami language. And especially in the Norwegian side, people, they are bilingual nowadays, and they tend to have the similar phonemes used both in Sami and in Norwegian. So whether it's conscious or not, and it's still language induced.
Yeah, and I think there are actually, I mean, that came up a few times, but I think Anderson's pretty clear that it's, and the others are too, that it sometimes can be conscious, but often isn't necessarily conscious as a speaker as they're processing it, and they're making these changes, but not necessarily at the level of consciousness. So yes, absolutely, a very important part of that.
Yes, Livio.
One problem which
Okay.
in the last 10, 15 years is, of course, the fact that you cannot really go straightforwardly according to Ham's principle, that you have to distinguish between internal and contact-induced changes, in the sense that in many cases, of course, the context plays the big role in saying that the context provides the basis for changes to take place, independent of the fact that they are evolutive in the sense of being the result of the reorganization of the grammar or resulting from the contact. So in many cases, for instance, working with my Walser Germans, I wouldn't say that, well, what they make changing the grammatical structure in interesting terms is simply the result of contact in sense of external change. So in this sense, not evolutive in this case. So I would say in this sense, it's rather difficult to keep the distinction between evolutive and adaptive, as Anderson's use it, in a strict way, because we know much more. I mean, I've been educated according to Ham's principle, distinguishing. So the first time I heard the concept contact-induced grammaticalization, for me it was meaningless, because either you have grammaticalization or it's contact-induced. But if you think seriously about the fact that it's not bad. I mean, it's clear that contact doesn't. It's not a fact that simply forces you to reconstruct internally or externally. It's simply a fact that is there, and you have to cope with it. So.
Do you want to answer? I'm not quite sure how to answer except to say yes. I think you're right, and that's in one way of thinking about it, that's what keeps us in business is the fact that it's complex, and the division is there, but there can be kind of interleaving at different layers of the language. I think do we have to stop, or are we? Oh, one more question? Yeah.
So just, I had the same question. So just how would you then distinguish between these different layers? Because obviously we're talking about things that they're different, but then they work together. So how would you do that?
Well, Eric Hampus said you have to do your homework, which means you have to pay attention to as much detail as possible. And I think in the same way that Henning did in separating out, there are general processes in the case of the depalatalization and the reassignment of the sounds. But then there are these little details that, oh, there's this dialect that does this, and look the way they're treated socially, and how do they react, and so forth. So I think you've got to take as much what Rich Janda and I called informational maximalism. You have to take as much into consideration as you can, which doesn't necessarily make it easy, but it makes it fun. I think we need to stop. Yeah. So thank you all. Unless you have Henning, do you have a no? Okay. Thank you all very much. Now you can. It worked. I thought it was good. Okay. So please come back. There's a coffee break, 15 minutes. Please come back because we have 2 more papers. Okay? No.
So nothing changes basically what he calls the evolutive changes. And I elaborate on Ohala and on.
Is it in that acceptation? Yeah. I have something in there. I should read it. I should read the other papers. Also, evolution, I used to know at that school. Yeah. Evolutive. Yeah. So, and there's no confusion. Yeah. The question is the relation for the group. You know, in the acquisition of the language. I don't want to defend what I thought.
No.
It's a lot of nuance to what you have. All interaction, yes, so you're trying to
The whole climate was everything was rule change.
Sound change, Impro-Marian sound change.
We have to put in his.
That was an adventure.
Yes.
Worked out pretty well.
Accommodation.
Accommodative changes, not adaptive.
Accommodative.
Because accommodative is more neutral.
Yeah.
Doesn't force you to take stance on debate, adaptive systems, etc.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting that you've done this work tracing the use of the terminology.
Yeah.
And I think what happens in linguistics is people read and they acquire ideas and they have their own words for everything. And so the transmission of the terminology is not so good.
Or if you want to say it's slightly different, so you don't call exactly the same thing.
Well, yeah, everyone wants to put their own stamp on things.
Like Ohana, for example, Ohana and I have known each other since 1970. One or two when I was linguistic professor.
So for us to be able to stream, we have to install some software onto the computer. And that sends the image over to our coding.
But use the microphone.
careful with things.
Because the sociologists generally use this term of accommodation, tuning, which is very important. And this is, I think, one way of generalizing about that
I
situation.
hear you.
It's
Hello.
not simply to accommodate or to tune themselves according to the environment, which is not in
Uh,
the context. It's the context, as people say. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
You'll have the PowerPoint to go through.
Yeah. I think it's a kind of a cognitive change or tuning, as you want to call
Hello.
it. Yeah.
Hello. I hear you. Do you hear me? Okay. Then we are connected. So, uh, I can see you.
Yes. All right. So I also need to switch the Wi-Fi over to our. Okay. And can we forget this network so that it doesn't switch over to it automatically? Yeah, delete it, and then you can reconnect that. Okay. And then one last thing.
Do you hear me?
Okay. So go ahead and get your screen layout the way you want it. Anna, are you getting? So my recommendation, if we can, unless you need to have this view.
No, I don't think so because.
Okay, so clear up, yeah, cancel out of this. And then somewhere in the options, maybe it's here. Yeah, oh, you know. Okay, here. Yes, this is better. Okay, so once she starts talking, if you could mute your microphone on this side. That way it won't make the horrible noises that we were having. You, so
聞こえます。
はい。で、今、どういう状況かというと、先生のパワーポイントが会場に移っている状態ですね。
あ、そうですか。じゃあ、始めてよろしいでしょうか。
まだでも45分からですから、8分。
maybe he could do hand
じゃあ、
signals.
このままで待って。
He can see on the webcam.
次というふうに言ってください。私が押すという形で。
あ、はい。はい、ほとんどもうスライドの通りに読み上げますので、多分終わりに来たら次と言いますけれども。
わかりました。はい。
はい。一応言います。はい。
She uses text, and I think the picture may there's an audience there. So instead, close her picture.
And have only audio.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't matter, right?
I think it's more important to have her visible. I think that's really great to have.
Okay, good.
You know, if we're missing a small portion of the words, looks really good. No, I just wanted to turn on presentation mode so it wouldn't pop up notifications. Do you know how to do that on this thing? Don't worry about it. I don't think it'll have it.
But how can I get back?
はい。待ちます。はい。
So you'll mute your microphone, right?
Here?
Yes. Now she won't be able to hear you, but that way it won't
Okay.
make noises. And then if you need to talk to her, unmute her. Okay, good.
Tokyo は暑いですか？東京は暑いですか？
あ、今日は涼しいです。
あ、そうですか。よかったです。
今日だけ涼しくなって、明日からまた暑いそうですけれども。
あ、そうですか。
はい。札幌も今日は涼しかったみたいですけれども。
あ、そうですか。
はい。そちらはどんなですか？暑いんですか？
そうですね。40度でしたね。
あ、そんなにあるんですか？
もう外に歩く気がしなくなりますね。もうなんか湿気も多いし。
ああ、それは大変です。でもあれなんですよね。その皆さん、泊まってるホテルが会場っていう形なん
そうですね。ただ僕が泊まってるところはすごく遠いところで、
あ、そうなんですか。
ちょっと移動が大変ですが。
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming, and it gives me a great pleasure to start the second part of the session dedicated to Professor Henning Andersson. The first presenter of the second part is Professor Keiko Mitani from the University of Tokyo and Hokkaido University. She is going to talk about evolutive change and adaptive change in Croatian. What Andersson's abductive and deductive model tells us about language change. So Professor Mitani, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, so you have 20 minutes, and then you have 5 minutes for your discussion. So please start.
Okay, I'll start. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this way. And I prepared slides in case I can, the Skype doesn't work, so please read the slides what I read. I just skip some phrases because of time. So the next slide, please. Yes. You see the main article, the second slide?
Just a moment, so it does, how, yeah, good.
You hear me?
Yes, it's okay. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So in this article, in his article, in his article, Abductive and Deductive Change, Henning Andersson introduced into historical linguistics the notion of abduction, a particular mode of inference first proposed by Charles Sanders Peirce. Combining it with another inference mode of deduction, he clearly articulated the significance of human ability to make reasoning in language change. Because this short essay is aimed at examining the significance of this model, in particular its claim of abductive-deductive inference as the first of language change, and also because the term abduction itself is ambiguous in that it's used differently in the contemporary set of logic, we first ascertain what abduction means in Andersson's model that we are going to discuss. Next, please. Abduction for Andersson is a type of inference by which an observed fact is related to a law, or rather for a discussion of particular knowledge the subject of inference has, and certain conclusions induced. A deduction, in contrast, is a mode of reasoning in which a law is applied to a case and the result is predicted. The point here is that the conclusion induced from abduction can be false, whereas the conclusion from deductive inference is always true as long as the first premise is true. So I skipped the last part, so please, next slide. Based on these two notions of reasoning, Andersson proposed explanatory model for both an internally motivated evolutive change and adaptive change. In both changes, adaptive and deductive inference are involved, but not in the same fashion. Evolutive change is a single abductive innovation followed by deductive ones, whereas adaptive change involves two stages of abduction, abductive innovation before reaching the deductive level, of which the first one introduces into language variation, and the second one adapts it for the actual use. While Andersson intended to present a model to explain the phonological change, our task here is to consider how this model can describe aspects of changes other than the phonological ones, and to ask what this model tells about the nature of language change. So next, please. Evolutive change may be illustrated with the change of nominal endings in Croatian. A remark is needed in advance, however. What is presented below is a quite simplified description. In reality, the shift of nominal endings advanced diversely with intercategorical gradualness, and should have taken generations for the interchange to complete. Contemporary Croatian uses the dative instrumental and locative plural, the same ending with ma. For example, prustima fingers for the dative instrumental and locative plural or masculine noun prust, finger, and rukama, hands, and miestima, places for the above three cases for feminine noun ruka, hand, and the neuter noun miesto, respectively. And historically, these endings with ma were not the plural, but the dual dative and instrumental forms inherited from Proto-Slavic, whereas the original plural endings of the dative and instrumental are, for example, om and e for the o stems, and am and ami for the a stem nouns. The use of dual forms in plural situations witnessed no later than the 15th century in a dialect known as Stokavian, from which contemporary standard Croatian developed. In the following, we'll talk about only the dative and instrumental cases. I skip the located cases. Located cases, it will be too complicated and too long. So next one, please. The Old Slavonic dual disappeared in most Slavic dialects in later development. Shtukavian belonged to such dialects. Dual verb forms ceased to be used by the end of the 13th century, and instead plural verb forms appeared for both plural and dual subjects. This dual loss in the verb conjugation triggered the subsequent fusion of dual and plural in the nominal category. Probably at this stage of ambiguity, around the 14th, 15th century, some Shtukavian speakers started to reinterpret the dual forms as to denote plurality, or rather non-singularity, particularly in oblique cases. In fact, the use of the dative and instrumental endings of dual origin with ma in plural meaning is evidence from the 14th century. Next one, please. And it is not clear what evoked this interpretation, as the neighboring South Slavic idioms retained the old plural forms, although the process of dual loss in the verb category took place commonly with Shtukavian. However, the reinterpretation of the dual forms as to mark plurality is not rare in Slavic. For example, similar reinterpretation is observed in many Czech dialects. Even in the verb conjugation, some Polish dialects retained the old dual personal ending to express the plural meaning. Given that the dual as well as the plural contains the semantic feature minus singular, dual forms may be as proper as plural forms to express the plurality in situations where dual-plural distinction is obscured. Thus, it is understandable that Shtukavian speakers medieval times, when the dual as a grammatical category was being lost, regarded these originally dual forms as marking the plurality. This abductive change was then followed by deductive stage in which speakers, thinking it was rude to use the ending with ma as plural forms, implemented this pattern. So next slide, please. And in this way, we can outline quite briefly the change of nominal oblique case endings in line with Anderson's model. And we should add here, however, that the change of the endings described above was not a simple replacement of dual forms by plural forms by dual forms. Comparing the old dual forms and contemporary plural forms of Croatian, we immediately notice that the dative and instrumental dual or O-stem nouns in Old Shtukavian were equally oma, but contemporary dative and instrumental endings of these nouns are ima. Consequently, an explanation more complex than a single abductive-deductive model should be subsumed in order to explain this change. And in fact, two factors were relevant in the appearance of ima instead of the expected form oma. One was the fusion or confusion of the dual and the plural as outlined above, and the other was the fact that the dative and instrumental of the dual was identical in all declensional types. So next, please. From these two conditions appeared the situation around the 15th century in which oma, om, and e were used for the dative as well as the instrumental plural of O-stem nouns, regardless of their original function. This chaotic situation further triggered the emergence of such forms as im and ima. These obviously contaminated forms, of which the first component e could be the instrumental plural ending or originate from the nominative plural ending. Whatever the origin of e in these forms, evidence of ima forms is found as early as the 15th century, like in Sinovtsima from Sinovat's nephew, and these forms became more and more frequent after the 16th century documents. In line with this Anderson's model, this change may be described as follows. Some speakers of this dialect in the above described situation began to select the ending ima as best, probably because this form could be regarded as composed of a general plural marker e for the masculine nouns followed by the new plural oblique marker ma. Indeed, by adapting e and ima endings, speakers can obtain, for example, from the nominative singular prust, finger, the nominative plural prusti, and the dative as well as instrumental prustima. Next one, please. And without going further into details, we can state that for some structural changes, such as described here, we need to subsume two or more sets of abductive-deductive changes that would take place concurrently or subsequently. Next, please. Now let us turn to the adaptive change. We will illustrate this with the semantic change of preposition in Croatian dialect in contact with German. It is well known that many Croatian idioms have long been in contact with other European languages such as German and Italian. Rogaland Croatian is one of such idioms. It's been spoken in the easternmost part of present-day Austria since the 16th century. In this idiom, the preposition priko, dialectic from the standard Croatian preko, is not used not only to mean the spatial relationship over across, such as priko most, across the bridge, but also to express the meaning of about, such as začel prek toga mislit, he began to think about it. Next one, please. This unusual use of priko in Bulgarian Croatian may be described as follows. Croats who immigrated to today's border zone between Austria and Hungary encountered German and naturally began to interpret overt forms of German by consulting their knowledge of their native language. Then they found a particular German word occurring in a situation in which they would use priko in its spatial meaning. They also noticed that the same German word was repeatedly used to mean about, which did not conform to the form-function association there, priko. This process of finding accordance and differences was, according to Anderson, still an inductive inference. But as time passed and when some speakers began to adjust their use of priko in harmony with the corresponding German word, the new use of priko to express the meaning about appears as a variant in the language community. Once this stage was reached, the later development could be subsumed in the same vein as the evolutive change. Speakers of later generations started to opt for the use of priko in both spatial and about situation, feeling that such use was more proper. And this stage has been succeeded by the situation in which the new use of priko is norm rather than a variation. Next one, please. And various structural changes or replications in contact situation may be described in the same fashion. But instead of continuing presenting other examples, we want to turn our attention to one point regarding the notion of abduction as is defined here. That is, the abductive-deductive change model is in harmony with the view that elements structurally foreign to a recipient language in contact situation are not borrowed or only incompletely borrowed. It is because the first and the second abductive reasonings, by definition performed in reference to the speaker's knowledge of the grammatical rules of that language, that any proper conclusion cannot be induced or is difficult to induce concerning foreign elements to which functional counterparts are not found in the native language. Consequently, any adjustment of the native pattern would not take place or hardly takes place. Next one, please. And for example, it is well known that many Slavic languages or dialects in contact with languages that have the grammaticalized article show the tendency to use demonstrative pronouns in places where the definite articles of the contact language are used. Indeed, in Moravian Croatian, a branch of Bulgarian Croatian spoken until the end of the 1940s in southernmost Moravia, speakers often used the demonstrative pronouns in some situations in which the German definite articles were expected. To illustrate, my consultant, who is a native speaker of this idiom, once said, "Ja sam ta drugi beef," which means that I was that second. Son is not expressed. And obviously, this utterance is parallel to the German structure "Ich war der Zweitsohn," with the Croatian demonstrative pronoun ta, that is the dialectic form of the demonstrative pronoun that, as an equivalent to the German definite article there. In Croatian, one could simply say without ta, "Ja sam drugi bih," or I was second son. Next one, please. This example might seem to indicate that Croatian speakers of this idiom interpreted the German definite articles and just the function of their demonstrative pronouns in accordance with the German articles. However, the same informant not seldom uses nouns without any demonstrative pronouns when, if German appearance of the definite article was expected. For instance, in Atlas, Yeposlafna Lapat, it means he sent someone to field. The masculine noun Lapat, field, appears as a bare noun. This is normal in Slavic, but not in accordance with the German habit by which the use of the definite article would be expected, as in this case in Svel, whose felt is neuter nouns and Lapat is masculine, but it's not the essential difference. If the speaker had properly adjusted the use of demonstrative pronouns to that of German definite article, he would have said Nalta Lapat. So next slide, please. The difficulty of borrowing definite articles to Croatian stems from supposedly the fact that the German definite articles are used not only when this deictic or anaphoric meanings intended, but also in various conditions and conventions, for example, with particular abstract nouns and so on and so on. And naturally, for those whose native language lacks grammaticalized articles, it is difficult to interpret in a coherent manner the function of overt forms that are in some aspects similar to their demonstrative pronouns. They could at best adjust the use of demonstrative pronouns in case when demonstrative or anaphoric meaning is transparent, and in particular when the noun appears in the syntactic subject position or its equivalent when the meaning of definiteness is clearly sensed. In other words, for all usage of the definite article to be interpreted and their appearance to be properly predicted, a long-lasting contact with the gradual advance of adaptation from a case-by-case inference to the grammar-based prediction would be necessary. Anderson's model of adaptive change implies, therefore, that borrowability of foreign element is necessarily related to the structure of native language. So next one, please. And in this short essay, we attempted to demonstrate how Anderson's model can describe structural change, and we could do it by referring to a formal as well as semantic change in Croatian. But what does this model tell us about the nature of historical change in language? Always contain variants of different nature or potential for change, but that not all such variants cause the language change. Then, which variant is selected by the speaker to become a factor to this question and answer as follows. Some variants become real variants or competitors of extant elements when some speakers will analyze them in reference to the grammar of the native language and place them then for the diffusion, these variants more and more regarded as part of the rules of the language structure, making the older forms as the less available. Next one, please. The abductive deductive model assumes language change, at least in its minimum level, as not from the extant structure of language, since a language change is therefore a result of long gradual changes, each step of which is structurally constrained. Rephrasing like this, we find that the gist of this model is quite close to a therefore governed in every instance by constraints on syntactic grammar, synchronic grammar. And another implication of this model is that structural change in language always change in the former starts with an internal variation and the latter is caused by an outside factor. The first stage of change emerges when a variance is related to the grammar of language in which the change is taking. The implication leads us to ask, at least theoretically, how the distinction of evolutive change and adaptive change is valid in the study of historical linguistics. So I'm finishing the studies concerning the historical change of language. Still, a question remains. If a language always contains variants and from them a change starts, then why are particular variants selected as to be further diffused in a particular language, while in other languages that have a similar grammatical system to the particular language, the same thing does not happen, as in the case of nominal endings occurring in Kaikavian, that is the dialect next to Shokavian. The abductive deductive model indeed well explains the way how language changes and how the human ability to infer is relevant to it, but does not provide an answerability with an inference not enough to explain language change. Given that language is a social performance, it is inevitable to consider social factors such as the communication environment and interpersonal relationships. So, references. So that's what I wanted to present. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Mitani. Can you?
Yes.
Affixes to the plural, very common in colloquial Czech. And I was shocked. And they told me, we have a Polish priest, and he came, which is the old Old Slavonic, blah, blah, blah. So what to be to 60s, 70s when I was not there. But the other thing I would say...
Professor Mitani?
I'm sorry, I could hear only partly. So could you summarize his question?
So she couldn't hear well, unfortunately. Are there any comments and questions? Yes.
I just want to, and I thought the conclusion was very good too, because no way of, so there.
It was a comment by Professor.
Are you asking me?
No, just Professor Anderson email from.
Yeah.
Well.
So our next speaker will be Motoki Namachi, who will be organized for this special session, and he will be returning to this idea of evolutive or evolutive versus adaptive with regard to the development of Kashubian existential.
Thank you, Brian. Henning Andersen introduced two types of phonological innovations, abductive and deductive, and on their basis distinguished two different types of linguistic change. So this is just a repetition which Brian already gave. So evolutive change entirely explainable in terms of linguistic systems. So adaptive change suggests that you can explain it as an evolutive change. That is preferable. And indeed, Andersen stated that the evolutive change should be valued more highly for its greater simplicity. As I will show, there are cases which could be explained as evolutive change turned out to be the adaptive. Therefore, two-sided assessment is particularly of importance. Andersen intended to account for historical phonological change, but his theory has been applied by many scholars as a universal model, explaining morphological and syntactic changes as well. In what follows, I will analyze possible syntactic changes in Kashubian, a West Slavic language spoken in northern Poland. A development of the existentials has been selected as it can serve as a useful criterion for the syntactic, synchronic and diachronic typology of Slavic languages. Let me start with a brief sketch of typological differences in Slavic existentials and then move on to an analysis on their development in Kashubian. Basically, two verbs are involved in Slavic existentials, to be or to have. And Slavic languages can be roughly classified into four groups in terms of the distribution of these two verbs. For simplicity, I provide the present tense forms only. So group one, for the affirmative construction, the verb be is used, and for the negative construction, the predicative no is used. This is a language, Russian is Slavic, and the example you have есть книга, it literally means is book, and for negative construction, нет книги. So нет is a negative predicative. And the group two, two verbs are used in combination, be and have, and you have three languages, Ukrainian Russian from Eastern Slavic and Polish from Western Slavic. And as an example, formative existential from Polish, jest książka, this is almost same as in Russian, be book is book, but for the negative construction, and the object should be in the genitive case. In this group three, be verbs, be's used. And the languages are Czech, Slovak, Sorbian, and defunct Polabian from West Slavic, and Slovene from South Slavic. The example is from Czech, Je kniha is book, and Není kniha. Okay, this is a little bit too simplified because in Czech there is a possibility the nominative case, just only genitive case is possible. So this is really simplified, but it does not matter. For negative, nema knihe. From this table, as a phenomenon, and the form is sometimes regarded as a Balkanism, and its ultimate source is power 2000, or by adaptive change, probably as in Ukrainian, according to Potebnia, 1899. The negative form considers whether this shared distribution is evolutive or adaptive in origin. Given Paul, if we look at the oldest situation, from attestations in OCS number 3 and OES number 4, Proto-Slavic B was the nominative likely order. For simplicity, I have just providing only the nominative pattern, but the genitive case does exist in the often appears with Polish situation. So according to Klemenshevich and others, 1960, as in the nominative case, and you have the Zbawienia in the genitive case. The process was completed in the 17th century. Pisarkova, Niema spread due to its utility for a negative particle and a negative predicate. This could be one of the reasons, but were often transcendental as indicated by Bauer, 1998. So this is the Latin source of the case as in vode, but in Latin in the accusative case. This is the difference. Bauer suggests that the emergence of Latin impersonal habeas and thus to the spread of transitive syntax. However, the stage of tendency to transitive syntax in Old Polish is different from that of Latin. First, equivalent of Michia's construction. Second, have plus infinitive had existed in the 13th, 14th century. On the one hand, in Old Polish started to first appear only in the 15th century in translation works, and it became common in the 16th, 17th centuries. Thus, it seems of the have existential in a series of changes. According to Petr, 1973, Latin began to have a considerable influence on Polish as literary language in the 16th century, and Polish-Latin bilingualism spread across social classes, not only elites but also burghers as well, and many Latin grammatical calques entered Polish. This suggests that in Polish, this change was an adaptive one. Although Latin affirmative habere existential did not enter Polish. This may be because Polish affirmative existential is transparent in meaning for. So let's move on to Kashubian, but first Slovenian. Until the 19th century, only religious texts are known in Slovenian, which has defunct since 1950s. All translated from German and clearly influenced by Polish because the translators consulted Polish religious books. Thus, these texts might not tell the precise path of diachronic change. Nevertheless, written for practical use by locals who knew neither Latin nor Polish, they should still give us a certain picture of the development path. So let's survey the changes. 16th century. 86 has only a few examples, but the negative have existential is already used. So Rubnia Niema. And in 17th century, the short catechism of Martin Luther dated to be as in number 12, number 13, and to have as in number 12. And 17th, 18th century, the situation does not differ much, but still both constructions are found. The second example is suggestive, as it is not just a literal translation from German, and one can see that productivity of the verb construction for the negative existential from this sentence. 19th century. The oldest dialect text from the 1860s contains only a negative have existential, as in 16. Thus, the Polish pattern was by then established. Was this evolutive or adaptive change? It is impossible to prove, unfortunately, but it might plausibly be an adaptive change induced mainly by the religious texts with their Polish syntax. The reasons are three. The first, Slovenian had surely established transitive syntax by then, and so the explanation of evolutive change does not work. Second, locals did not know Latin, as I said, and so the Polish case should not be excluded. And the third, religious texts influenced by Polish were treated as a high variety that was used in their daily life. In addition, the genetically closest language, Polavian, that had quite a similar socio-linguistic situation to Slovenian in terms of German-Slavic bilingualism, did not develop the verb existential at all. The most important socio-linguistic difference between the two is that Slovenians used religious texts influenced by Polish for centuries. Now let's move to another construction. So according to Bauer 1996, the use of give in existential clauses is limited to Germanic, and in Western dialect occurs only in German. However, some Slavic languages, including Kashubian, also have the give existential. Now you can see the model, and these are concrete examples. So in 19 was taken from Lorenz's text recorded at the end of 19th century. Our Professor Andersen, Lorenz of Kashubia. And as in number 20, if you compare this example with 19, you can notice that in 19, you can see the dummy subject it, to, but in 20, you don't have these subjects. And 20 and 21 were taken last year and this year, and it has found out that the use of dummy subject is not obligatory. So, what is the origin of this construction? According to Brian, to say so, can I say so like this, well, Professor Joseph, the German S-gift could be an archaism retaining an aspect of the earlier semantic of verbs such as take, hold, have. For Kashubian, this explanation is not the only choice, since under the strong German influence, this language has many contact adoptions. And now, chronology is also suggested. According to Newman, 1998, S-gift construction became widespread in the 16th and 17th centuries, while in Kashubian, not a single example has been attested until the end of the 19th century. So, most probably, this construction came from German. So, now, what is the problem? As in other Slavic languages, and unlike in German, Kashubian verbs are either perfective or imperfective. For instance, the verb das, to give, is perfective, and its imperfect counterpart is davat. In Kashubian, as in other North Slavic, the non-past form of the perfective expresses the future, and the imperfective means the present. So in the give existential, the form of the verb itself is perfective, da, not dava. It does not convey the future as in number 19. So although the perfective form is used in the present non-present, non-past tense, non-past tense form, but the meaning is just present. So indeed, and adverbial phrase meaning repetition or duration of a situation that primarily collocated with the imperfective verbs can be used here as in number 12. I'm talking about the adverb biedno, always is easily to collocate with the imperfective verb, but although this form itself is perfect, it can be used in this construction. In addition, notably, this construction cannot drive the analytic feature form, unlike the imperfective verb. For the future tense meaning, the non-past tense form is used as in number 12. So you cannot tell just by form if this is a present situation or future situation. Only the context carries the future meaning. In this respect, that's functioning like, in some sense, perfect. Why the perfective verb is chosen? Possible reason is that the verb should not mean in action of giving per se, but rather a stative situation. Today, this give existential is disappearing, reflecting that lack of German influence after the World War II. However, the pattern of its decline is hard to establish. In some cases, younger speakers still use it, while older ones do not anymore, and in others, vice versa. And another problem is that Kashubian has another impersonal construction. So, number 12 at 22, upolu to dawo dobre junibo. So, just by form, you can have two readings. Number one, there was a good harvest in the field. This is just pure existential reading, as in German. But in number two, it produced a good harvest. So this is non-existential reading. So a good harvest emerged or has emerged. But yes. And the meaning of give is more natural in the second reading, in the present-day speakers who do not know German at all. Also, Polish, the mother tongue of all Kashubs today, does not have the same construction as Kashubian already has established existentials with the be and have that I discussed before. So just let me summarize what I have discussed. First, the negative have existential in Old Polish is not an evolutive development parallel to related languages, but an adaptive change due to the strong Latin-Polish bilingualism that emerged in the 16th century. The second, the negative have existential in Slovenian dialect may be an adaptive change due to influence of Polish existentials, because in the historical text, the later dialect texts, the distribution of the existential verb is identical in the two languages. Okay, and the third, Kashubian has had the give existential since the late 19th century due to an adaptive change caused by German Kashubian bilingualism. However, this construction is now disappearing due to both loss of German influence and the rise of Polish influence. So this is my tentative conclusion because unfortunately, this is still on my ongoing project on historical syntax of historical comparative syntax of West Slavic languages. And of course, evolutive change is more attractive, so there may be any way to change my opinion to evolutive change, which is highly evaluated. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you, Motoki. We have time for plenty of time actually for questions and any other comments on the other papers if there are any.
Should I use it? So the question is kind of a comment. We discussed this actually. So I'm not very comfortable with this general generalizations in general. Speaking about Ukrainian, number 2, for example, this pattern is clearly something is missing here, as Professor Henning Andersen can say it for the phonological system, which is split in the case of Ukrainian. The same we can posit for the morphosyntax of Ukrainian. Unfortunately, due to some political circumstances, the have pattern, which exists actually in Ukrainian, has not been clearly described in some reference books. You understand why, because we have something different in Southwest Ukrainian. So I can just clearly state that we have a pattern like have in some dialects. So I think that you have just to look into this and find perhaps some interesting dialectal evidence and facts which can bring you also to number 2 and number 4, speaking about Ukrainian. And the second one, as I told you, I don't remember where, but it seems to me Shevelov clearly wrote that Nema in Ukrainian was attested before Nema was attested in Polish. In some of my work, I don't remember where, I connected it with the appearance or emergence of imati without the initial vowel. At some point, it was dropped. This is why in Ukrainian we have the future tense in mu as a result of this phenomenon. And according to Shevelov, you can just double check, it seems to me in 1979, this historical phonology, he provides some interesting attestations and dates which can help you perhaps to revise slightly your first conclusion with regard to the evolutive or borrowing or some other changes in Polish Nema.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for your very, very important comments, and I fully agree with you. This, as I said that in my presentation, this is very rough classification and based on the standard language only. Of course, in Serbian, there is a different way of patterning, and in dialect, it is kind of mess, to say so. And thank you very much for the information that in Ukrainian you have the have construction which I can easily imagine. By the way, today I did not mention, but in Slovenian, only a very short period, positive have construction was seemingly developed. I just only a few examples, which is very rare. So I do not know how productive it was, but in any case, there is a natural way of developing the verbs in this respect. And what else? Oh yeah, with regard to Ukrainian, yes, I should have investigated more, or to be honest, I really did not do anything. And I just relied on the idea of Potevnia, who said that the have construction in Ukrainian was attested just after the emergence of this construction in Polish. So this was one of the arguments, but he did not analyze much material, so I was not really sure, but this is just a tentative orientation, to say so. And thank you very much for the information about Shevelov. Thank you.
Can you please go to the conclusion slide? So, it's the last point. So here you suggest that the change, if you like, is being reversed, right?
Yeah.
So, and what is happening now, you think, is also adaptive change. So the loss is also adaptive change because the influence of German is no longer there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you are assuming that once this change happened, it became part of the system, right? So I'm trying to understand how the external influence of German is working now, or since then, since German ceased to have that influence. in the performance of the native speakers. So what's the mechanism of that? So once there is no German around them, this construction becomes unstable.
Yeah, unstable.
So,
yes,
the presence of German has always been important for the construction to remain?
No, it depends. So the problem is that in that area, they are practically all Polish speakers, and Polish and Kashubian very similar. So easily the influence of Polish can penetrate into the system of Polish. So today, present-day Kashubian speakers are really, there are many semi-speakers of Kashubian, to say so. So instead of German form, the Polish construction with the same or near same meaning can replace the German construction. So this is one thing. But with regard to sociolinguistic fact, now Kashubian being officially recognized minority language in Poland, some speakers would like to use more German constructions as a marker of their identity. So in this case, some constructions are still, German constructions are used more often than before, but I have to be more careful, and I have to work on quantitative research. Yes, but in general, situation is like that.
Thank you for this very nice survey and for the important question of either evolutive or adaptive. As you mentioned Serbian as a B instance, there we have not be for the past tense and not have for the present tense, but this present tense, how it developed is probably a vexed question, because in medieval Serbian, let's say 12th century and later, you have a very strong modal usage of have to. So in fact, have to, and this is specifically found in the present, that someone has to do something, or something has to happen or made happen, and this may have been an internal source of this asymmetry by which the negative existential present has whereas the past has preserved the be, probably. What do you think about that?
Well, to be honest, I didn't think about it, and thank you very much for your suggestion. And yes, the comparative survey with Serbian would definitely help me to understand the deeper in this respect. Thank you very much.
Yes. No, Henning.
I would like to respond to this last one, and then I have another comment. I think you could very easily have ima in two different functions. One as a direct object with a direct object, and the other one with a sentential object with da, ima da, doda, or whatever. So they have very different syntax, and you could have.
I'm talking about the medieval stuff.
But it's the same thing. All right, then with something else. I just wanted to take this opportunity to mention that the verb have is also a verb of existence. It's usually said that it's a verb of possession, but it's always existence in relation to someone. And it's characteristic for have that it does not form a passive. And that shows that it's really an existential verb. I don't really think that I will believe in a pervasive Latin influence in Belarus and the Ukraine and Poland. I think it's very difficult to conceptualize that. So I would vote for an independent development, just as we have in Latin and in parts of the Romance world. I mean, French too has the verb
Yeah,
to
yeah,
have.
yeah.
I don't know if we can take a vote on this. Maybe we shouldn't try to do that. But anyway.
Thank you for your comments.
All the Slavic languages I mentioned, so Czech, obviously. We are unique. I was unaware of it. Sorry. That we have a perfect. The only Slavonic language which have perfect. I can say, mám to napsáno, mám knihu napsánu, or mám napsanou knihu. Mám knihu napsanou would be something else. And so my question is, what do you do with imati? Imati. So Russian has imneju, of course, used very sparingly. But in Ukrainian, pisachimu. So there you have it. You do something with what? Is it a different verb?
Take, yeah.
Oh, that's yim, emo. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, okay, correction. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, the first
But
point.
stay with the Czech. So I mean, you know, here you have additional Ukrainian. Sorry, I take it back. Yeah,
Okay,
that's
thank
Latin
you.
emo.
Yeah,
I know.
the first
Okay,
point is
yimati.
important. I mean,
Yeah,
the so-called possessive perfect, but terminology itself is perfect, but it's just resultative, but not
Yeah.
grammaticalized so wholly. So, well, this is one of the possible way to move forward to the transitive syntax, but well, it's a kind of enigma. In Polish, for instance, in 17th century, 16th century, one can find resultative construction, but by the end of the 19th century, the situation did not change at all. So still remained as a resultative. So I think the situation, I'm not really sure, but judging from the work by Giger, who wrote about the Czech resultative, the situation is not that different from that of Polish, which means that in Czech, this construction does not have the perfective meaning.
Well, that might be the perfect time to. So, thank you all very much for thank you all very much for attending, and thank you, Henning, for giving us this opportunity to gather and thank you for taking this up. And Motoki, I think we could high five. Yeah, it worked. Amazing. We actually got some people to attend. Even more amazing.
And that's it for today, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Very sorry for my
Hello.
phone going up.
No, I didn't pay attention.
Yes.
Turned off, and I don't know how I
No, I did not notice that.